You didn't click this because you were curious. You clicked because something in you felt slightly exposed. There's a quiet cost to continuing exactly as you are. You feel it sometimes. Not as fear, more like a dull pressure you can't quite name. And the strange part is, you've learned to look away from it. Not because you're weak, not because you're unaware, but because your brain is very good at protecting familiar identities, even when they no longer fit. Take a breath for a moment. Not on purpose, just notice that you already did. That's where this begins. There are things you know without ever having learned them. You've had moments, small ones, where life felt slightly misaligned. Nothing dramatic, no crisis, just a subtle sense that something was off. Maybe it showed up as restlessness, or boredom that didn't match how good things looked, or the odd feeling that you were performing your own life instead of living it. You probably didn't talk about it, most people don't, because when nothing is wrong, it feels unreasonable to question anything. So your brain does what it's designed to do. It smooths the edges, it explains the discomfort away. It says, this is normal, everyone feels this. And on the surface, that sounds reassuring. But beneath that reassurance, something keeps watching. You. Not the version with your name, your habits, your routines. Something quieter, more observant. That part doesn't speak loudly. It doesn't interrupt your day, it just waits. And every so often it notices what your brain prefers not to. Here's the strange thing. Your brain isn't trying to deceive you. It's trying to keep your identity intact. Identity is expensive to update. It costs energy. It costs certainty. Sometimes it costs relationships, timelines, versions of yourself you've invested years into. So instead of changing identity, the brain adjusts perception. It filters. It reframes. It redirects attention toward what feels stable. That's not a flaw, that's survival. But survival isn't the same as alignment. And at some point, often quietly, you begin to sense the difference. Let that land for a second. Not as an idea, as a memory. You've felt this before. It's interesting how clarity doesn't arrive as answers, but as a pause where something finally stops pretending. Most people think confusion comes from not knowing enough, but that's rarely true. Confusion often comes from knowing something too early, before your sense of self is ready to rearrange around it. So the awareness shows up as friction. You start feeling tension around choices that used to feel easy, paths you committed to begin to feel heavier, even when nothing changed externally. You tell yourself you're overthinking, that you should be grateful, that this is just how adulthood works. And again, your brain is helpful here. It offers explanations that preserve continuity. You're just tired. This phase will pass. Everyone feels like this sometimes. All of those statements are true and incomplete, because underneath them, there's a quieter recognition forming. Not a thought, a perception, that something in you is no longer where it used to be. You don't panic about it, you adjust, you scroll more, you stay busy, you intellectualize your emotions, anything that keeps the identity stable. But awareness doesn't disappear just because it's ignored. It waits. And it watches how far you go, trying not to notice it. At first, this feels like nothing. Later, you may realize it was the moment everything started subtly reorganizing. Your brain loves conclusions, even incorrect ones. A conclusion creates closure. Closure reduces uncertainty. Uncertainty feels unsafe. So when awareness begins to stretch beyond identity, the brain offers substitutes. It gives you narratives. I just need a new goal. I need to work harder. I need to figure myself out. Notice how all of these keep the focus on effort. Effort feels productive. Alignment feels ambiguous, so effort wins. But effort without alignment creates a specific kind of exhaustion. Not physical, existential. You're tired even when you rest. You're distracted even when you focus. You're busy but somehow behind yourself. This is where many people start blaming time. If I had more time, things would make sense. But time isn't the missing variable. Perception is. Sometimes the fatigue isn't from doing too much, but from being someone you've quietly outgrown. Awareness doesn't push, it reflects. It shows you where you're misaligned by how things feel, not by what happens. That's why two people can live the same external life and experience it completely differently. Reality isn't responding to effort, it's responding to identity. And identity is shaped by what you consistently choose to notice. Your brain, however, prefers consistency over truth. Consistency keeps the story intact. So when awareness begins to highlight subtle mismatches, the brain reframes them as mood, motivation issues, or random dissatisfaction. But awareness isn't random, it's precise. It points exactly to where you're still living from an old reference point. You might recognize this in moments where you surprise yourself. You react strongly to something that shouldn't matter. You feel drawn to ideas or paths that don't fit your current life. You feel a quiet pull towards something undefined. Your brain labels this as distraction. Awareness knows it as information. You sense something is off. You ignore it. Life feels slightly heavier. You search for solutions. None quite fit. The sensing returns clearer than before. Each loop tightens perception, not to trap you, to clarify you. It's strange how the most important signals never shout. They repeat. There's a reason this recognition doesn't arrive all at once. If it did, identity would fracture. So forgetting is built in. You forget what you sense the moment it threatens stability. You remember just enough to feel tension, not enough to act. This isn't punishment, it's pacing. Awareness unfolds at the speed identity can survive. That's why growth often feels cyclical. You see, you forget, you see again, slightly deeper. Each pass loosens the grip of the old story. Some people interpret this as being stuck. They're not stuck, they're buffering, loading a new internal orientation while still operating the old one. Later, this pattern may reveal itself not as delay, but as careful sequencing. Every choice you don't make doesn't disappear. It becomes a version of you that continues elsewhere, not in some fantasy sense, but as a lived orientation of identity. You felt this when imagining different paths, not fantasizing, recognizing. Certain futures feel heavier, others feel strangely familiar. That familiarity isn't prediction, it's resonance. Your awareness recognizes versions of you that already exist as potential alignments. Your brain, again, intervenes. It says, be realistic, but realism is just probability based on the past. Awareness operates on possibility based on coherence. There's a reason some ideas won't leave you alone. They aren't demanding action, they're highlighting identity. You don't feel pulled toward something because it's missing, you feel pulled because it matches. What you're experiencing isn't isolated, it's subtle but widespread. People everywhere are questioning paths they once accepted without thought. Not loudly, not rebelliously, quietly. The old formulas still work, but they don't satisfy. So awareness is surfacing beneath routine lives, not to dismantle them, to realign them. This is why conversations feel different lately, why certainty feels less convincing, why listening feels more important than convincing. Identity is loosening, collectively. And your brain feels that instability as threat, so it urges you to cling harder to definitions. But awareness recognizes the opening. When certainty weakens, perception sharpens. Alignment doesn't require force, it requires honesty. Not confessional honesty, perceptual honesty. Seeing what feels heavy without explaining it away. Noticing what feels alive without justifying it. This is uncomfortable for the brain, because alignment doesn't come with instructions. It comes with a shift in identity reference. You begin making choices that don't match your past logic. You feel calmer about things you used to chase, more attentive to what used to feel irrelevant. This isn't regression, it's reorientation. What's forming now may only make sense once you notice what no longer demands your energy. Life doesn't reward alignment, it reflects it. When you move closer to coherence, reality feels smoother, not easier, but clearer. Resistance doesn't vanish. It becomes informative instead of draining. You stop asking, why is this happening? And start noticing, what is this showing me? Not intellectually, experientially. This is where awareness becomes embodied. You may notice you're less interested in being right, less compelled to prove anything, more curious about how things feel internally than how they appear externally. Your brain may interpret this as losing ambition. It's not. It's losing distortion. When effort relaxes, perception takes the lead. You are not discovering who you are. You are noticing where you are in motion. Identity isn't a fixed self. It's a path of attention. Where you place awareness consistently becomes who you experience yourself as. That's why small shifts matter. What you tolerate, what you linger on, what you stop explaining. These are identity decisions, even when they feel passive. Some people call this awakening, others call it burnout. Neither quite fits. It's quieter than that. It's the moment the internal mirror becomes harder to ignore. There's a reason the idea of parallel versions of self feels less abstract lately, not as science, as experience. Some people explore this more deeply, sometimes through books like Parallel Realities, not to escape this life, but to understand why certain choices feel heavier or lighter before they're made. Not answers. Orientation. If you've stayed this long, notice something. Nothing was demanded of you. Nothing was explained away, and yet something likely shifted, not dramatically, but enough to be noticeable later. That's how awareness works. It doesn't conclude, it continues. You may find yourself remembering this at odd moments, during routine tasks, in quiet pauses. Not the words, the feeling. You might gently ask yourself, not now but sometime later, what part of you has been patiently waiting for your identity to catch up? No answer needed, just noticing. Because this conversation doesn't end here, it echoes. And you'll recognize it again the next time your brain tries very hard not to notice what you already do. Your brain loves conclusions, even wrong ones. A conclusion feels like safety. It closes the loop. It says nothing more to see here. That's why when something inside you starts to feel slightly misaligned, your brain rushes to name it. You're tired. You're stressed. You just need motivation. You need a new plan. Notice how fast explanations appear, not because they're accurate, but because they keep the story intact. Identity depends on continuity, and continuity depends on explanation. So the moment awareness begins to surface, quietly, gently, the brain redirects attention toward effort. Try harder, fix yourself, optimize. Effort feels active. Awareness feels destabilizing. Effort gives the illusion of control. Awareness asks you to pause, and pause is dangerous to an identity built on momentum. Here's something subtle you may recognize. You've worked hard before, really hard, and sometimes it worked, you moved forward, things improved. But other times, the harder you tried, the heavier everything felt. Not because you were failing, because effort was being applied in a direction your awareness had already outgrown. The brain doesn't like that realization, so it reframes the tension as lack of discipline, or inconsistency, or distraction. But the tension isn't about discipline. It's about direction. There's a specific kind of exhaustion that comes from pushing yourself toward a life you no longer fully inhabit. It doesn't show up as collapse. It shows up as dullness. You keep going, you function, you perform, but something feels oddly muted. Joy doesn't disappear, it thins. Motivation doesn't vanish, it fragments. You're not unhappy, you're misaligned. And misalignment is harder to diagnose because nothing is wrong. Your brain prefers problems it knows how to solve. Awareness doesn't present itself as a problem. It presents itself as a question without language. So the brain translates it into something manageable. A productivity issue, a mindset issue, a confidence issue. All solvable, all safe, but none quite touch the core sensation. Pause here for a second, not to think, just to notice. There's a difference between feeling blocked and feeling pointed in a direction you're not ready to face. Your brain treats both the same way. Awareness does not. This is why distraction feels comforting. Scrolling, noise, constant input. Not because you're avoiding something dramatic, but because silence allows awareness to speak. And awareness doesn't speak in words, it speaks in sensation. You may have noticed this. The moment you slow down, a strange discomfort appears. Not anxiety, not fear, a kind of internal pressure, as if something is waiting for acknowledgement. Your brain quickly fills that space. I should be doing something. I'm wasting time. This isn't productive, but productivity isn't the issue, presence is. Here's the part your brain really doesn't like. Awareness doesn't need improvement. It needs permission. And permission threatens identity. Because once you allow yourself to notice what feels off, without fixing it, the old explanations stop working. And when explanations fail, perception sharpens. That's when the micro-loop begins. You feel tension. You explain it away. The explanation loses energy. The tension returns clearer. The brain works harder. The awareness grows quieter and deeper. Not to defeat you, to outweigh your resistance. The brain is fast. Awareness is patient. The brain wants closure. Awareness wants coherence. And eventually, not suddenly, not dramatically, you begin to sense the difference. Awareness doesn't interrupt your life. It reflects it. It doesn't argue. It doesn't convince. It doesn't demand change. That's why it's so easy to miss. You don't hear awareness. You notice it after something already feels different. A conversation that lingers longer than it should. A decision that suddenly feels heavier than expected. A quiet relief when a plan falls apart. Not relief because it failed. Relief because you don't have to carry it anymore. Your brain struggles with this because brains are trained to evaluate outcomes, not sensations. So when awareness mirrors misalignment, the brain looks for evidence. Nothing is wrong. This makes sense. You chose this for a reason. And all of that may be true, but awareness isn't interested in reasons. It's interested in resonance. Here's a subtle distinction most people miss. Discomfort doesn't always mean danger. Sometimes it means honesty. The kind of honesty that doesn't explain itself. You feel it when something stops fitting the way it used to. Not dramatically, gently. Like clothes that still look fine, but restrict your movement just enough to be irritating. You don't throw them away. You just stop choosing them. Awareness works the same way. You may recognize moments where your reactions surprise you. You disengage faster than expected. You lose interest in arguments you used to fight hard for. You stop chasing clarity from people who can't give it. Not because you became indifferent, because awareness has already updated your internal map. Your brain hasn't caught up yet. This creates an unusual experience. You're still living one life while sensing another one forming underneath it. Not as fantasy, as alignment. Certain paths feel quieter, others feel loud in a way that drains you. Your brain asks, which one is safer? Awareness asks nothing, it just shows you which one feels coherent. This is where many people get confused. They think awareness is pulling them somewhere. It isn't. It's revealing where they already are. Notice how this changes the pressure. There's nothing to chase, nothing to escape. Just a mirror showing what's current. And mirrors can feel confronting, not because they judge, but because they remove denial. You might have felt this in still moments. Early mornings, late nights. The space between conversations. A sense that something is reorganizing, without instructions. Your brain may label this as uncertainty. Awareness knows it as transition. Here's something important. Mirrors don't tell you what to do. They show you what's happening. And once seen, it can't be unseen. This is why people sometimes feel unsettled after moments of clarity. Not because they learned something new, because they can no longer fully believe the old story. The brain tries to restore balance. It adds noise, it adds urgency, it adds distraction. But awareness doesn't compete. It waits. Over time, you may notice a shift. You stop asking, what should I do? And start noticing what feels false when I try to do it. That's not indecision, that's discernment. You're not losing direction, you're losing distortion. And when distortion fades, reality feels different. Not easier, clearer, less effortful to interpret, less draining to inhabit. This is the function of awareness as a mirror. Not to push you forward, but to show you, quietly and consistently, where you already stand. If awareness were meant to arrive all at once, it would have already done so. The fact that it doesn't isn't a flaw in you. It's a design. You notice something. It feels important, clarifying, and then it slips. Not completely, just enough. Later, you wonder why it didn't stay clear, why the insight faded, why the certainty softened. Your brain often interprets this as regression. I lost it. I wasn't ready. I didn't hold on strongly enough. But forgetting isn't collapse. It's pacing. Awareness doesn't overwhelm identity. It negotiates with it. Identity is built slowly, through repetition, memory, and narrative. If awareness shattered it too quickly, you wouldn't feel enlightened. You'd feel destabilized. So awareness does something quieter. It shows you a little. Then it steps back. It allows the old structure to continue operating while the new orientation quietly integrates. This is why clarity often arrives in waves. You see, you adjust slightly, you forget, and then later, in a different context, the same recognition returns, deeper, less dramatic, more embodied, not as an idea, as a way of standing inside your life. Your brain wants to capture insight, to label it, to repeat it, to make it permanent. But awareness isn't static, it's relational. It responds to who you are now, not who you were when the insight first appeared. So when identity shifts, the same truth has to be reintroduced, not because it changed, because you did. You may notice this pattern. Something that once felt urgent now feels obvious. Something that once felt confusing now feels neutral, not resolved, integrated. That's not forgetting, that's absorption. There's a specific moment many people experience. They remember an old realization and think, how did this ever feel complicated? Not with arrogance, with curiosity. That's awareness completing a cycle. But before integration, there is often disappearance. A sense that the clarity slipped through your fingers. This is where patience matters. Not effort, not analysis, just allowing the loop to complete. Here's the loop, if you watch closely. Recognition, excitement or relief, mental ownership, subtle tension, forgetting, re-emergence in lived experience. Most people try to interrupt this loop. They cling to the insight. But insight isn't meant to be held, it's meant to be lived. This is why forcing understanding feels frustrating. Understanding arrives when identity has room for it, not before. Your brain doesn't like this because it can't track progress linearly. It wants milestones, checkpoints, proof. Awareness offers none, only a quieter sense of coherence. So when you feel like something slipped away, consider a different possibility. Maybe nothing was lost. Maybe it moved from thought into structure. This is also why growth feels invisible while it's happening. You notice it only in hindsight, when you respond differently, when old triggers no longer grip you, when choices feel lighter without explanation. You didn't forget, you updated. And updates don't announce themselves. They reveal themselves when something that used to pull at you no longer does. At some point you stop waiting for clarity to arrive, not because everything is clear, but because you notice something else has changed. The urgency is gone. You're no longer trying to fix the feeling. You're no longer arguing with it. You're just aware of it. The same way you're aware of your breath without needing to control it. That's when the brain relaxes, not because it understands, but because it realizes it doesn't have to. You may notice that certain questions no longer demand answers. Not in a defeated way, in a settled way, they're still there. They just don't pull at you anymore. And in that space, something unexpected happens. Attention softens. You begin to feel your life instead of constantly interpreting it. There's a quiet moment, often unnoticed, when you realize you're no longer waiting to become someone else. You're already here, not finished, not complete, but present in a way that wasn't available before. This doesn't look like certainty. It looks like trust without language. You still plan, you still choose, you still move forward, but the movement comes from coherence, not pressure. From alignment, not urgency. Your brain may still try to step in sometimes. It may ask, is this enough? Shouldn't I be doing more? Am I missing something? And you don't fight those questions. You let them pass, because awareness has taught you something quietly important. You don't need to solve yourself to live as yourself. There's a reason this recognition doesn't feel dramatic. Truth rarely does. It feels ordinary, almost obvious, like something you've known for a long time, but never stopped long enough to notice. If you think back, you may realize this conversation didn't really start when the video began. It started earlier, in moments you didn't name, in discomfort you couldn't explain, in pauses you usually filled. This video just gave those moments a place to sit. You might find yourself returning to this feeling later, not to remember the words, but to recognize the state, the quiet sense that nothing is wrong, even when nothing is resolved. Some people explore this state further, sometimes through reflections like those in parallel realities, not to find answers, but to stay oriented as identity continues to shift, not forward, not upward, just more honestly. And now, as this moment settles, notice something gently. You're not being told what to do next. You're being left where awareness naturally continues on its own, because the most important part of this conversation was never meant to happen here. It happens later. When you catch yourself noticing what your brain usually rushes past, and this time you don't.